Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like this video and subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments what time you're currently listening to this, and where are you listening from. Now, let's get right into the story. The sketchpad was still open on the passenger seat. That was the detail that stayed with people. Not the abandoned car, not the keys left in the ignition, not the wallet and phone sitting undisturbed in the center console. It was the sketchpad, a charcoal study of a gnarled coastal gum tree, half finished, the last strokes still carrying the energy of a hand in motion, as if the artist had simply been lifted out of the world mid-sentence. The charcoal stick itself lay on the seat beside it, rolled against the spine of the pad, placed down rather than dropped. Whoever Eliza Hayes had been drawing for, she'd stopped on purpose. She'd set the charcoal down carefully, and then she was gone. The car, a deep sapphire blue Subaru Forester, 3 years old, well-maintained, sat on a gravel pull-off along the great ocean road between Lorne and Apollo Bay, a stretch of coastline so beautiful it borders on menacing. To the left, the Otway Ranges pressed in, walls of dense temperate rainforest that could swallow a person in 30 years. To the right, the land dropped away in sheer limestone cliffs to the Southern Ocean, which on the evening of May 12, 2023, was a churning gray expanse whipped white by an approaching storm. The pull-off was unmarked, the kind of spot locals used to photograph the sunset and tourists missed entirely. There were no streetlights, no buildings, no cameras. A perfect place to stop and sketch the landscape. A perfect place to disappear. Eliza Hayes was 23 years old. She was in her final year at the Victorian College of the Arts in Melbourne, studying painting, and she was the kind of student her lecturers described with the specific enthusiasm reserved for people who are going to matter. Her work was large-scale, gestural, a collision of landscape and abstraction that drew from the Australian coastline the way other artists drew from dreams, pulling out shapes, colors, and emotions that were always there, but that most people couldn't see until Eliza showed them. She'd grown up in Geelong, an hour southwest of Melbourne, the only child of Jeffrey and Helen Hayes. Jeffrey was a secondary school history teacher, 52, with the ruddy complexion and steady temperament of a man who'd spent 3 decades explaining the causes of World War I to teenagers and had emerged from the experience with a patience not only intact but deepened. Helen was a physiotherapist at the Geelong Hospital, quiet where Jeffrey was warm, precise where he was expansive, and devoted to Eliza in the way that people who aren't naturally demonstrative sometimes are. Through action, through presence, through the framed paintings that hung on every wall of their weatherboard house in Belmont. Eliza's boyfriend was Ben Carter, 25, a junior architect at a firm in Melbourne. They'd been together for 2 years. The weekend of May 12th was supposed to be theirs, a Friday to Sunday escape at an Airbnb near Apollo Bay, a timber cottage set back from the coast in the Otway hinterland. Ben had driven down on Friday morning. Eliza was to follow that evening, after finishing some work in her studio. She called her father at 4 p.m. from the studio. Jeffrey remembered the conversation because it was so normal it hurt to replay. She was excited. She'd been working on a new series inspired by the Otway coastline, the twisted forms of the coastal gum trees, the way the light changed when the weather turned, the violence of the ocean against the cliffs. She was bringing her sketch pad to work on-site over the weekend. Jeffrey had told her to drive carefully. The great ocean road was treacherous after dark, especially with rain coming. Eliza had laughed and said, "Dad, I've driven it 100 times." She told him she loved him. He told her he loved her. She hung up. She left the studio at 5:15 p.m. A security camera in the building's car park captured her loading her overnight bag and a canvas tote into the Subaru. She was wearing a green parka over a dark jumper, jeans, and boots. Her auburn hair was loose. She looked, in the footage, like a person who was happy, unhurried, relaxed, looking forward to something. She drove south out of Melbourne, picking up the M1 toward Geelong, then joining the Great Ocean Road at Torquay. The journey to Apollo Bay was roughly 2.5 hours in good conditions, longer in the dark and rain. The Coastal Weather Bureau had issued a warning for heavy rainfall and strong winds along the surf coast from 8 p.m. onward. At 7:23 p.m., Eliza's phone connected to a cell tower near Lorne. At 8:01 p.m., it pinged a tower near Wye River, further west. At 8:34 p.m., the phone went dark. Ben Carter began calling her at 9:30 p.m. when she hadn't arrived at the Airbnb. By 10 o'clock, he called 6 times. By 11 o'clock, he was in his car, driving east along the Great Ocean Road, retracing the route she should have taken. At 11:47 p.m., he found the Subaru. He knew it was hers before he pulled over. The sapphire blue was unmistakable, and the car was the only vehicle on the pull-off. He parked behind it, got out, and walked to the driver's side. The door was unlocked. The interior light was on. The keys were in the ignition. Her phone was in the console, her wallet in the glove box. The overnight bag was in the back seat, unopened. The sketch pad was on the passenger seat, open to the gum tree drawing. Ben called 000 at 11:52 p.m. Then he called Jeffrey Hayes. Jeffrey received the call at midnight. He and Helen drove to Apollo Bay in the dark, arriving at 2 a.m. to find the pull-off lit by the red and blue strobes of 3 police vehicles and a search and rescue van. The rain had started by then, heavy, slanting, the kind that turned the clay shoulders of the Great Ocean Road to grease. The Subaru sat in the middle of it all, illuminated like a museum exhibit, water streaming down its windshield, the interior light still glowing. Jeffrey stood in the rain and looked at the car and felt the ground shift beneath him. Not literally, something deeper. The tectonic shift of a parent's reality dividing into before and after. She wouldn't leave the car, he told the officers. She wouldn't leave her phone. She wouldn't leave that sketch pad. She was working on that drawing. He was right, and everyone on the scene knew it. Detective Inspector Rowan Sharma was notified at 6 a.m. on May 13th, 2023. He arrived at the pull-off by 8:30. Having driven from Melbourne in deteriorating weather, the Great Ocean Road living up to its reputation as one of the most beautiful and dangerous stretches of highway in the country. Sharma was 48 years old, a career detective with Victoria Police's Missing Persons and Serious Crime Divisions. He was compact, solidly built, with the unhurried precision of a man who had learned that speed was less important than accuracy, and that the loudest voice in an investigation was usually wrong. His dark hair was salted with gray, his eyes intelligent and watchful, his suit perpetually slightly rumpled, not from carelessness, but from the reality of a job that didn't observe regular hours. He carried a leather notebook that he'd used for over a decade, its pages a palimpsest of solved and unsolved cases, and he preferred it to any digital tool because paper didn't crash and couldn't be hacked. He stood at the pull-off and studied the scene with the focused patience of a man reading a geological formation, layer by layer, looking for the thing that didn't belong. The car's position told him something. It was parked nose in toward the cliff edge, the driver's side facing the road. This was how someone would park if they'd stopped deliberately, pulled over, chosen the spot, oriented the vehicle for the view. Not the position of a car that had broken down or been forced off the road. The interior told him more. No signs of struggle, no blood, no torn fabric, no scuff marks on the dashboard or door panels. Eliza's belongings were undisturbed. The sketchpad's placement was careful, intentional. The charcoal stick hadn't rolled to the floor. It was resting against the pad spine, placed there by a hand that wasn't in a hurry. The forensic team dusted for prints and found Eliza's throughout the vehicle, as expected, and a second set on the exterior of the passenger door. Partial, smudged, potentially from a petrol station attendant or a car wash. The gravel around the car was too disturbed by the overnight rain and the responding officers' vehicles to yield useful tire or footprint impressions. The pull-off itself offered two directions of departure. To the east, a narrow walking track descended through dense bush toward a rocky cove accessible only at low tide. To the west, the road continued toward Apollo Bay, with no other pull-offs for 3 kilometers. Behind the car, the Great Ocean Road curved back toward north. In every direction, the landscape was either impenetrably dense or fatally steep. If Eliza had left the car voluntarily, where had she gone? And if she hadn't left voluntarily, where was the evidence of force? Sharma had worked disappearances before, more than he cared to count. They fell, roughly, into categories: voluntary departures, accidents, and foul play. The car's condition argued against an accident. There was no mechanical failure, no skid marks, no indication that Eliza had been incapacitated. The undisturbed belongings argued against a voluntary departure. People who chose to disappear took their phone and their wallet, which left the third category, hanging in the salt air like the smell of the approaching storm. Sharma ordered a full search of the surrounding terrain, the walking track, the cove, the bush in both directions. He requested helicopter support for an aerial survey of the coastline, and he began the interviews. Ben Carter was first. He sat in the back of a police vehicle, wrapped in a foil blanket, his face gray with exhaustion and a fear that was rapidly hardening into something worse. He was cooperative, detailed, clearly devastated. He'd arrived at the Airbnb at noon on Friday, spent the afternoon reading and cooking dinner for 2. He'd texted Eliza at 6 p.m. She'd replied that she was on the road, making good time. He texted again at 8 o'clock. No reply. I started calling at 9:30. Found the car at 11:47. Sharma asked the question he always asked. Was there anyone who might have wanted to harm Eliza? Any conflicts? Any threats? Anyone who'd shown unwanted interest? Ben shook his head. Then he paused. There was a bloke, he said slowly, at the petrol station in Lorne. Eliza mentioned it last time we drove down. She said a guy was staring at her while she filled up. She said it wasn't the normal kind of staring. She said it felt. He searched for the word. Deliberate. Did she describe him? Thin. Rough-looking. She said he looked like he lived outdoors. Sharma wrote it down. The search team spent 3 days combing the terrain around the pull-off. The walking track led to a cove that was empty, scoured by tides, offering no evidence. The bush on either side of the road was so dense that a person moving through it would leave obvious signs of passage. Broken branches, disturbed undergrowth, and none were found. The helicopter survey of the coastline revealed nothing. No clothing, no personal items, no body on the rocks below. Eliza Hayes had not fallen from the cliffs. She had not walked into the bush. She had not gone down to the cove. Whatever had happened to her had happened on that gravel pull-off, and the rain had washed the evidence into the ocean. Except for one thing. On the third day, a forensic technician re-examining the Subaru's exterior found something the initial sweep had missed. On the rear bumper, caught in the seam between the bumper and the body panel, was a single fiber, synthetic coarse, faded blue, consistent with heavy-duty workwear. It was not consistent with anything Eliza owned or wore. Someone else had been close enough to Eliza's car to leave a trace on it. The name Silas Croft surfaced for the first time on May 17th, 5 days into the investigation, through the most mundane of channels. a routine canvass of local businesses. A cashier at a service station in Apollo Bay told Sharma's team that a man matching a general description, thin, weathered, rough-looking, had been coming in irregularly for weeks, buying tinned food, cigarettes, and water with cash. He never gave a name. He never used a card, but the cashier remembered him because of his eyes, gray, like the ocean before a storm, and they never stopped moving. A farmhand at a property inland from the coast provided a name. The man had done casual fencing work on the property in late April. He'd called himself Silas. He'd arrived on foot, worked for 3 days, slept in a shed, and left without notice. The farmhand described him as quiet, competent with tools, and unsettling in a way he couldn't quite articulate. He watched everything, the farmhand said, not like he was curious, like he was mapping it. Sharma ran the name through the system. Silas Croft, 38, no fixed address. Born in Ballarat, left home at 17. A string of minor offenses across rural Victoria. Petty theft, trespass, public intoxication. The record of a man who lived on the margins and occasionally brushed against the law without ever fully colliding with it. His last known contact with police was 14 months prior, a caution for sleeping rough in a national park near the 12 Apostles. No violent offenses. No history of assault, stalking, or sexual crime. On paper, he was a nuisance, not a predator. But Sharma had been doing this long enough to know that paper was only the beginning of a person's story. He located Croft on May 21st, 9 days after Eliza's disappearance. Croft was working as a casual laborer at a sheep station 40 kilometers inland from Apollo Bay, mending fences in a paddock that looked out over a vast, empty stretch of the Western District. He saw the police car coming from a long way off and didn't run, which Sharma noted. He stood by the fence line, pliers in hand, and waited. Up close, Croft looked exactly as he'd been described. Wiry, gaunt, his skin darkened and creased by years of sun and wind. His sandy brown hair was long and unkempt, his jaw covered in patchy stubble. He wore faded blue workwear, heavy cotton trousers, and a utility shirt, the kind issued by farm supply stores, and boots that had been resoled more than once. His most striking feature was his eyes, pale gray, restless, constantly scanning, as if the landscape around him contained threats that only he could see. And near his left eye, a nervous tick that pulsed in a steady, involuntary rhythm. "Mr. Croft," Sharma said, "I'd like to talk to you about the night of May 12th. Croft's tick accelerated. His eyes moved from Sharma to the police car to the fence line and back. When he spoke, his voice was low and graveled, the voice of a man who didn't use it often. "I figured you'd come," he said. He didn't ask why. He didn't ask what it was about. Sharma noted that too. They spoke at the station, not under arrest, not under caution, just a voluntary conversation in a bare interview room that smelled of instant coffee and floor polish. Croft sat with his arms folded, his body angled toward the door, every line of his posture communicating a man who wanted to be anywhere else. "I was walking along the coast track," he said. "I walk it most nights. It's quiet. I like the quiet. Where exactly were you?" "Between Kennett River and the pull-off where they found her car. I know one. I've slept there before, in the bush behind it, when the weather's bad. And on the night of May 12th, I saw the car, the blue one. It was parked there, engine off, lights off. I could see someone in the driver's seat. A woman. She was drawing something. What time was this? I don't carry a watch. After dark. Maybe 8:30. The rain hadn't started yet. Did you approach the car?" Croft's jaw tightened. The tick near his eye fired rapidly. "No." "Did you speak to the woman?" "No." "Did you see anyone else?" "Another vehicle, another person on the track." Here, Croft paused. It was a long pause, the kind that fills a room with its own weight. Sharma waited. He was very good at waiting. There was a van, Croft said finally. His voice had changed. Lower, more careful, as if each word were being weighed before release. A white van. It was parked further up the road, maybe 200 meters west. Lights off. I didn't think much of it. People park along that road all the time. But when I came back, I walked to the cove and back. Maybe 40 minutes, the van was gone. And the woman's car was still there, but she wasn't in it anymore. The door was open. The interior light was on. And you didn't report this. Croft looked at Sharma for the first time, a direct, unblinking stare that held something complicated. Not guilt, something closer to resignation. I'm a bloke with no address and a record, he said. I reported a missing woman from the side of the road at night. And you're not going to look at me before you look at anyone else. Which is exactly what happened. He was wrong. And Sharma, to his credit, acknowledged it. Not aloud, but in the small recalibration that happened behind his eyes. Describe the van, Sharma said. White. Commercial type, like a tradesman's van. No windows in the back. No signage that I could see. It was facing west toward Apollo Bay. Did you see the driver? No. The windows were dark. Number plate? Croft shook his head. Too far, too dark. It wasn't much. A white van on a road where white vans were common. No plate. No driver. No direct connection to Eliza. But it was a detail that hadn't existed before this conversation, and Sharma treated it the way he treated all new details, with careful, provisional respect. He released Croft and sent a team to check the coast track for any corroborating evidence of his movements. They found a rough camp in the bush behind the pull-off, a tarp strung between two trees, a fire pit, a plastic bag of tinned food, consistent with Croft's claim that he used the area regularly. They also found, pressed into the mud of the track 50 meters from the camp, a set of footprints that forensic analysis later confirmed matched Croft's boots. The prints led to the cove and back, consistent with his account. Silas Croft was not eliminated as a person of interest, but his story, for the first time, had physical corroboration. And his story included a white van that no one else had mentioned. Sharma pivoted. He pulled CCTV from every camera along the Great Ocean Road between Lorne and Apollo Bay. Service stations, hotel entrances, council traffic cameras. The coverage was patchy, the road's remoteness working against him. But on May 24th, his team found it. A traffic camera at the eastern approach to Apollo Bay, timestamp 9:17 p.m. on May 12th. 43 minutes after Eliza's phone went dark, captured a white commercial van heading west into town. The footage was low resolution, shot in rain, but the technical team enhanced it enough to extract a partial registration number. 3 characters, Victorian plates. It was enough to narrow the field. A cross-reference of the partial plate against the Victorian Vehicle Registry returned 14 matches for white commercial vans. Sharma's team began working through them. 11 were eliminated quickly, registered to businesses with verified locations, accounted for on the night of May 12th. 2 more were eliminated within a week. One in a mechanic's workshop for repairs, the other confirmed by GPS tracking data to have been in Melbourne. The 14th van was registered to a man named Darren Kemp. Kemp was 41 years old. He lived alone in a rented house on a rural property outside Colac, 30 minutes north of the coast. He was a self-employed handyman, painting, basic carpentry, odd jobs, who operated from his van. His record was unremarkable. No criminal history, no flags, no complaints. He was on paper nobody, but when Sharma's team pulled his phone records, a pattern emerged. Over the 6 weeks prior to Eliza's disappearance, Kemp's phone had ping towers along the Great Ocean Road on at least 9 separate occasions. Always in the evening, always on the stretch between Lorne and Apollo Bay. The pings were concentrated on weekends and corresponded to dates when the weather was poor and the road was quiet. He wasn't driving the coast for work. He was driving alone on it. Sharma obtained a warrant and searched Kemp's property on June 3rd, 3 weeks after Eliza's disappearance. The house was unremarkable, sparse, clean, the home of a man who lived simply and alone. The van was parked in a corrugated iron shed behind the house. Inside the van, the forensic team found what the ocean and the rain had tried to erase. A strand of auburn hair caught in the rubber seal of the van's rear door. DNA analysis confirmed it as Eliza Hayes's. In the van's cargo area, luminol testing revealed traces of blood, clean but not thoroughly enough, on the floor and the interior wall panel. The blood was Eliza's, and in a locked toolbox bolted to the van's floor, investigators found Eliza's green parka, folded neatly, as if it had been kept. Darren Kemp was arrested at 6:14 a.m. on June 4th, 2023. In the interview room, he was nothing like Silas Croft, where Croft had been restless, evasive, vibrating with the energy of a man who lived on alert. Kemp was still, unnervingly still. He sat with his hands flat on the table, his posture upright, his expression neutral. He was of average height, average build, with thinning brown hair and a face so unremarkable that Sharma understood immediately how this man had moved through the world without anyone noticing him. That was the point. Darren Kemp had designed his entire life around not being noticed. When confronted with the evidence, the hair, the blood, the parka, Kemp did not deny it. He didn't confess either. He sat in that terrible stillness for a long time, and then he said, "I'd like to tell you where she is." He led a search team to a location deep in the Otway Ranges, 7 kilometers off the nearest road, accessible only on foot through dense bush. Eliza's body was recovered from a shallow grave on June 6, 2023, 25 days after she disappeared. The forensic examination determined that Eliza had died from blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with a heavy, irregular object. The estimated time of death was the night of May 12th. There were defensive injuries on her hands and forearms. She had fought. Kemp's account, given over 2 days of interviews, was clinical in its detail and devastating in its emptiness. He had no prior connection to Eliza. He had never met her, never spoken to her, didn't know her name until he saw it in the news. He had seen her car on the pull-off, a woman alone on a dark stretch of road, and he had stopped. That was it. No motive beyond opportunity. No grudge, no obsession, no twist ideologic. A man in a white van on a quiet road had seen a woman alone and had decided, in whatever broken calculus passed for reasoning inside his mind, that the opportunity was sufficient cause. Sharma asked him why. Kemp looked at him with those unremarkable eyes and said, "I don't know." It was, in its way, the most honest and the most horrifying answer possible. Jeffrey Hayes was sitting in his living room in Geelong when Sharma called with the news. Helen was beside him, her hand on his arm, the way it had been for 25 days. The house was full of Eliza's paintings, the coastal landscapes, the abstracts, the riot of color that she'd poured into the world as if she'd known, somehow, that her time to pour would be short. Jeffrey listened. He thanked Sharma. He hung up the phone. Then he walked to the hallway, where a framed photograph of Eliza hung beside the front door. A candid shot, her auburn hair caught by the wind, her green eyes laughing at something outside the frame. And he stood in front of it for a very long time, one hand pressed flat against the glass, as if he could feel her warmth through it. He would later tell a journalist that the worst part wasn't the grief. The grief was enormous, all-consuming, the kind of thing that rewrites the physics of a person's daily life. But the worst part was the randomness. There was no reason. There was no why. His daughter had pulled over on a beautiful stretch of road to sketch a tree, and a man in a van had seen her. And that was the entire chain of causation. No warning signs. No preventable failure. Just a woman alone and a man who shouldn't have been. Darren Kemp stood trial at the Supreme Court of Victoria in November 2023. He pleaded guilty to murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum non-parole period of 30 years. Silas Croft was formally cleared as a person of interest. His account of the white van, the detail that had ultimately redirected the investigation, was acknowledged by Sharma in his final case report as the single most important piece of witness testimony in the investigation. Croft was never thanked publicly. He didn't expect to be. He went back to the coast, back to the track, back to the margins where he'd always lived. Sharma closed the file on a Wednesday afternoon, 6 months after it had opened. He placed it in the cabinet with the others, the solved and the unsolved, the neatly resolved and the ragged, and stood at his office window. Melbourne's skyline glittered in the winter light, a city of 5 million people going about their evenings, each one carrying their own private architecture of love and fear and ambition, each one assuming, as people do, that the world will still be there in the morning. He thought about Eliza Hayes, the sketch pad on the passenger seat, the charcoal study of the gum tree, left unfinished, the last mark made by a hand that would never make another. He thought about the moment she pulled over, tired probably from the drive, drawn to the view the way she was always drawn to the landscape, reaching for her pad the way other people reach for their phones, because the world was something she needed to capture, to hold, to make visible. She'd been doing the thing she loved. She'd been alone with the coastline and the coming storm and a gnarled tree that had caught her artist's eye. She'd been, in that moment, exactly who she was. And then a white van had pulled up behind her, and the drawing had stopped. Jeffrey Hayes established the Eliza Hayes Foundation 6 months after the trial, funding art scholarships for young women from regional Victoria. The foundation's logo was adapted from the unfinished gum tree sketch, the last drawing Eliza ever made, completed now in spirit if not in charcoal, its twisted branches reaching upward into an empty sky. Helen Hayes returned to work at the Geelong Hospital in January 2024. Her colleagues said she was quieter than before, more precisely, as if the loss had refined her into something sharper and more fragile at the same time. She kept a small print of one of Eliza's paintings on her desk, a coastal abstract, all blues and greens, and the suggestion of wind. Ben Carter moved to Sydney. He didn't talk about it. And on the Great Ocean Road, the pull-off where Eliza's car was found remains unmarked. There is no plaque, no memorial, no flowers tied to a post. Just gravel and cliffs and the ocean below and the coastal gum trees bent by decades of wind into shapes that only an artist would stop to draw. The road goes on. The landscape doesn't remember, but the people who loved her do, and that, in the end, is the only kind of memorial that matters. The cursor was still blinking. That was the detail that Detective Inspector Amar Diallo would come back to long after the case was closed. The cursor on Chloe Du Bois's laptop, pulsing at the end of an unfinished sentence in a half-written essay on digital privacy. The screen hadn't timed out. The laptop was still plugged in. The sentence read, "The illusion of anonymity online creates a power asymmetry that..." It stopped there, mid-thought, mid-word almost, as if the person writing it had been interrupted by something that couldn't wait and had never come back to finish. Chloe Du Bois never came back to finish. The landlord found her on October 20th, 2023. His name was Gerald Henderson, 63, retired electrician, the kind of man who noticed things because decades of wiring houses had trained him to pay attention to what was wrong in a room. He'd come to the second-floor apartment on Queen Street West because the mail was piling up and because Chloe's rent, which she paid with almost neurotic punctuality on the first of every month, was 4 days late. The door was unlocked. Chloe was meticulous about locking it. He knocked, called her name, pushed it open. The apartment was small, tidy, and smelled faintly of jasmine tea. A half-finished mug sat on the coffee table beside a dog-eared copy of The Grapes of Wrath. The laptop was open on the desk, the cursor blinking. Sunlight came through the bay window and fell across the hardwood floor in warm, clean rectangles. Chloe was on the bedroom floor, partially visible through the open doorway. She was lying on her side, her auburn hair covering her face. One arm extended, as if reaching for the bedside table where her phone sat, screen dark. A single missed call from her mother glowing in the notification bar. Henderson didn't touch anything. He backed out of the apartment, sat on the stairs, and called 911. His hands, he would later tell officers, wouldn't stop shaking for 3 days. Chloe DuBois was 22 years old. She was a third-year journalism student at Toronto Metropolitan University, still called Ryerson by everyone who'd attended before the name change. And she was the kind of student that professors mentioned to each other in the hallway, not because she was the loudest in class, but because her work was startlingly good. Her writing was precise, curious, and unafraid. She'd published 3 investigative pieces in the university paper already, one of which, an expose on predatory landlords targeting international students, had been picked up by the Toronto Star. She was 22, and she was already doing the work. She'd grown up in Ottawa, the only child of Mark and Isabelle DuBois. Mark was a civil servant with Natural Resources Canada, quiet, methodical, the kind of father who showed love through logistics, driving Chloe to debate tournaments, proofreading her essays, building a desk for her dorm room with his own hands. Isabelle was a French teacher at a bilingual high school, expressive where Mark was reserved, the parent Chloe called when she needed to talk something through, and the parent who called Chloe when too many hours had passed without a text. The last text Isabelle received from her daughter was sent at 9:47 p.m. on October 17th. Safe and sound, working late on an essay. Can't wait for Thanksgiving. Love you, man. Isabelle had replied with a heart emoji and gone to bed. When she woke up the next morning and saw no response to her follow-up text, she felt the first stirring of unease. By the evening of October 19th, after 2 days of unanswered calls, she'd contacted the Toronto police. By the time the missing persons report was filed, Chloe had been dead for approximately 48 hours. Amara Diallo arrived at the apartment at 11:15 a.m. on October 20th, 40 minutes after Henderson's call. She was 38 years old, a detective inspector with the Toronto Police Service's Homicide Unit, and she carried herself with the particular stillness of a person who has learned that the first 5 minutes at a crime scene matter more than the next 5 days. She was tall, athletic, with short dark hairstyle close to her head and brown eyes that people described variously as sharp, piercing, and the kind that make you feel like she already knows what you did. She wore a charcoal blazer over a white blouse, flat shoes, no jewelry except a plain watch. Her background was unusual for homicide. She'd spent 6 years in the cybercrime division before transferring, and she brought with her a fluency in the digital world that most of her colleagues in homicide lacked. She could read a crime scene, but she could also read a hard drive, and in 2023, the second skill was often more important than the first. She stood in the doorway of Chloe's apartment and took it in. The tidy living room, the tea, the book, the laptop. the open bedroom door and what lay beyond it. The absence of forced entry, no damage to the lock, no marks on the door frame, no broken windows. Whoever had entered this apartment had either been let in or had a key. She moved through the space without touching anything, her eyes cataloging details the way a scanner reads a page. A single earring on the floor near the front door, small, silver, a stud, likely dislodged during struggle. A faint scuff mark on the hallway wall, knee height, consistent with someone being pushed against it. The bedroom. The bed was made undisturbed. Chloe was on the floor between the bed and the window, positioned in a way that suggested she'd been trying to move toward the bedside table, toward her phone, when she'd lost consciousness or been pulled back. There was no weapon visible, no blood. The violence, whatever form it had taken, had been close and personal. Diallo called the forensic team and the medical examiner. Then she walked back to the living room, stood in front of the laptop, and read the unfinished sentence on the screen. The illusion of anonymity online creates a power asymmetry that she made a note to have the laptop imaged immediately. Dr. Ben Carter arrived at the morgue at 3 p.m. that afternoon. He was 49, the chief forensic pathologist at the Toronto Medical Examiner's Office, a man whose career had been built on the principle that dead people are the most reliable witnesses. They can't lie, can't misremember, can't be intimidated into silence. He had gray-flecked brown hair, methodical hands, and eyes that his colleagues described as gray in color and gray in temperament. Analytical, dispassionate, calibrated to see what was there rather than what he expected to find. The autopsy of Chloe Dubois took 4 hours. Carter's findings, delivered to Diallo in a conference room at 8 p.m. that evening, formed the foundation of everything that followed. Cause of death: asphyxiation due to manual strangulation. The hyoid bone was fractured, consistent with sustained, forceful pressure applied to the throat. Petechial hemorrhaging in the eyes and the lining of the lungs confirmed the mechanism. Time of death: between 10 p.m. on October 17th and 2 a.m. on October 18th. But it was the secondary findings that shaped the investigation. Chloe had defensive wounds on both forearms, linear bruises consistent with blocking or deflecting strikes. She had abrasions on her knees and palms, consistent with being forced to the ground. And beneath her fingernails, Carter had recovered 2 things: microscopic synthetic fibers, black, consistent with a knit fabric like a balaclava or a glove, and skin cells. DNA from the skin cells was extracted, profiled, and entered into the national database. Carter also flagged an anomaly in the toxicology report. Chloe's blood contained trace levels of flunitrazepam, rohypnol. The concentration was low, suggesting either a small dose or a dose administered sometime before death, but its presence was unmistakable. Someone had drugged Chloe Dubois before killing her. This wasn't impulsive, Carter told Diallo. The sedative suggests premeditation. He came prepared to incapacitate her. The strangulation suggests he wanted proximity, control. This is someone who wanted to be close to her when she died. Diallo sat with that for a moment. Then she asked the question that had been forming since she'd first seen the apartment. The door wasn't forced. She let him in, or he had access, Carter said. She knew him. That's her department. But the evidence is consistent with a victim who was conscious and mobile when the encounter began. The defensive wounds predate the sedation, and who was subdued chemically before the final act. She fought first. He drugged her. Then he finished it. Diallo drove back to the station and began building the digital profile of Chloe Dubois' life. Chloe's laptop was a journalist's toolkit, organized, comprehensive, and revealing. Her browser history showed a woman deeply engaged with her work. research databases, news archives, court records, freedom of information portals. Her recent search history was focused on a piece she'd been developing about online harassment and the failure of platforms to protect users from anonymous stalkers. The irony was savage. Her email accounts, she maintained 3: personal, university, and a dedicated journalistic address, were orderly and voluminous. The personal account was unremarkable. Family correspondence, friend group chats, appointment confirmations. The university account was academic. But the journalistic account contained a thread that made Diallo stop scrolling and start reading very carefully. Over the previous 4 months, Chloe had been in contact with an anonymous source who went by the handle CypherGhost. The initial emails were transactional. CypherGhost had reached out offering information related to a story Chloe was working on, a piece about data brokers selling personal information harvested from social media. The source provided documents, screenshots, insider details. The information was good. Chloe had verified portions of it independently. But the tone of the correspondence shifted around week 6. CypherGhost's messages became more frequent, more personal. He began asking about Chloe's life, her schedule, her friends, her habits. He complimented her writing in ways that crossed the line from professional admiration to something possessive. He referenced details about her daily routine that she hadn't shared with him. The cafe where she studied, the route she walked to campus, the jasmine tea she bought from a specific shop on Dundas Street. Chloe had noticed. 3 weeks before her death, she'd sent CypherGhost a message that read, "I appreciate the information you provided, but I'm not comfortable with the personal nature of recent messages. I'd like to keep our communication strictly professional, or I'll need to end it." CypherGhost's response was a single line, "You don't get to decide when this ends." Chloe had not replied. She forwarded the exchange to a friend with the note, "This source is getting weird," keeping a record just in case. But she hadn't gone to the police. She hadn't blocked the account, and the emails from CypherGhost had continued. For more messages over the following 3 weeks, each one shorter, each one colder. The last one sent at 6:12 p.m. on October 17th, 5 hours before the estimated start of the window in which Chloe died. It read, "I told you. You don't decide." Diallo stared at that message for a long time. Then she began the work of finding the person behind it. CypherGhost's emails were routed through encrypted servers, VPN chains, and disposable accounts. The digital equivalent of a series of false doors designed to send pursuers in circles. But Diallo had spent 6 years in cybercrime, and she knew that perfect anonymity was a myth. People made mistakes. They reused passwords. They logged in from locations that could be triangulated. They left metadata in attached files that they didn't know was there. The documents CypherGhost had sent Chloe with a weak point. They were PDFs, and PDFs carry metadata, authoring software, creation dates, and sometimes, if the sender isn't careful, the name of the computer or user account that generated them. 2 of the 12 documents CypherGhost had provided contained metadata traces. One carried a fragment of a username, jvance_02. The other carried a creation timestamp that corresponded to a specific time zone, Eastern Standard, consistent with Ontario. jvance. Diallo ran it against every database she had access to. Julian Vance, 34 years old, last known address, a basement apartment in Scarborough, a suburb of Toronto. He'd come to law enforcement's attention twice before. Once in 2019, when a woman in Hamilton filed a harassment complaint alleging that Vance had stalked her online for 6 months after she rejected him on a dating app, and once in 2021, when a university student in Waterloo reported receiving threatening messages from an anonymous account that police had been unable to trace at the time. In both cases, the complaints had gone nowhere. Insufficient evidence. The victims had been told to block the accounts and change their passwords. The system had absorbed Julian Vance's behavior and returned him to circulation twice. Diallo pulled his photograph from the 2019 complaint file. The man looking back at her was unremarkable in the way that made her skin crawl. The specific unremarkability of a person who had cultivated blandness as camouflage. Medium height, medium build, receding brown hair, blue eyes that carried a washed-out, tired quality, as if the face they belonged to had been scrubbed of distinguishing features on purpose. He looked like the kind of man you'd sit next on the subway and forget before the next stop. She cross-referenced Vance's phone records with the timeline of CipherGhost emails. The correlation was damning. On the dates and at the approximate times that CipherGhost had sent messages to Chloe, Vance's personal phone had pinged cell towers and locations consistent with the VPN exit nodes the emails had been routed through. It wasn't a perfect match. VPNs introduced geographical noise, but the pattern held across 12 data points. The probability of coincidence was negligible. And then the DNA came back. The skin cells recovered from beneath Chloe's fingernails were run through the national database. Vance wasn't in it. His prior complaints hadn't resulted in arrests, so his DNA had never been collected. But Diallo had anticipated this. She'd obtained a warrant for a covert DNA collection, a discarded coffee cup retrieved from a trash bin outside Vance's Scarborough apartment by a plainclothes officer. The lab results arrived on November 9th. The DNA from the coffee cup matched the DNA from beneath Chloe's fingernails. Julian Vance had been inside Chloe Dubois's apartment on the night she died, close enough to be scratched, close enough to leave pieces of himself under her nails as she fought for her life. Diallo briefed her team at 6 a.m. on November 10th. By 7:30, the tactical unit was at Vance's door. He opened it in a t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair uncombed, his eyes carrying that same flat, washed-out quality from the photograph. When the officers told him he was under arrest for the murder of Chloe Dubois, his face performed an expression that was engineered to look like confusion, but landed somewhere closer to calculation. "I don't know who that is," he said. It was the last voluntary statement he made. His solicitor arrived within the hour, and Vance retreated behind a wall of no comment that held for the first 2 interview sessions. Diallo was patient. She had spent 6 years in cybercrime learning that the people who hide behind screens are, almost without exception, less impressive in person. The anonymity they crave online is not confidence, it's compensation. Strip the screen away, put them in a room with fluorescent lights and a recording device, and they shrink. She didn't confront Vance with the DNA immediately. She started with the emails. She printed every message CipherGhost had sent to Chloe and laid them on the table, one by one, in chronological order. She didn't read them aloud. She didn't need to. She simply placed them in front of Vance and watched his eyes. His solicitor objected. Vance said no comment, but his eyes moved across the pages with a speed that betrayed familiarity. He wasn't reading them for the first time. He was reviewing them. Then Diallo placed the metadata analysis on the table. The username fragment, the timestamp, the cell tower correlations. She walked through it methodically, the same way she'd walked through code, line by line, connection by connection, each piece of evidence linking to the next in a chain that tightened with every page. Vance's jaw worked. His solicitor requested a break. Diallo granted it. When they returned, she played her final card. She placed the DNA report on the table. "Chloe Dubois scratched you," Diallo said. "She fought you, and she left your DNA under her fingernails. We matched it to a sample collected from your residence. It's a full profile match, Mr. Vance, you were in her apartment the night she was killed. You were close enough for her to scratch you. And your digital fingerprints are on every message that threatened her in the weeks before her death. The room was silent. The fluorescent lights hummed. Vance stared at the DNA report the way a person stares at a door that has just closed and locked. His solicitor leaned in and whispered. Vance listened, his eyes still on the paper. Then he looked up at Diallo, and for the first time, she saw something behind the manufactured blankness. Not remorse, not fear, but the specific frustration of a man who believed he was smarter than everyone in the room and was being forced to confront the evidence that he was not. She was going to ruin me, he said. His solicitor put a hand on his arm. Vance shook it off. She was going to write about me. She'd figure out who I was. She was going to publish my name, my real name, and connect me to everything. The accounts, the messages. She was going to destroy my life. So you destroyed hers, Diallo said. Vance's mouth opened, then closed. The calculation was back. The internal debate between the story he wanted to tell and the story the evidence had already told for him. I didn't plan to kill her, he said. I went there to talk, to make her understand that she couldn't publish that story. I brought something to calm her down in case she got upset, just to talk. But she wouldn't listen. She said she was going to publish it anyway. She said she'd already sent copies to her editor, and I couldn't let her do that. So you strangled her. Vance didn't answer. He looked at his hands, the hands that had closed around Chloe Dubois's throat while a sedative worked its way through her bloodstream, and said nothing. The interview was suspended. The charge was laid. Julian Vance was charged with first-degree murder. The Crown's case rested on the DNA, the digital evidence, the toxicology, and Vance's own partial confession. His defense argued diminished capacity, that Vance suffered from an untreated personality disorder that impaired his ability to form intent. The jury did not accept this. The trial lasted 9 days. On March 22, 2024, Julian Vance was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment with no eligibility for parole for 25 years. Mark and Isabel Dubois sat in the gallery throughout the trial. Mark, who had not spoken publicly about Chloe's death, read a victim impact statement on the final day. His voice, which Isabel later said she had never heard break before in 30 years of marriage, broke twice. He spoke about building Chloe's desk. He spoke about proofreading her essays and watching, year by year, as her writing got better, sharper, more certain. He spoke about the essay that was still open on her laptop, the cursor still blinking, the sentence still unfinished. My daughter was writing about the dangers of anonymous power on the internet, he said. She was killed by a man who proved her thesis. Isabel did not read his statement. She sat beside her husband, her hand on his arm, and when the verdict was read, she closed her eyes and pressed her other hand flat against her chest, as if holding something in place. Diallo closed the case on a Friday afternoon in April 2024. She placed the file in the cabinet, stood at her desk, and looked at the photograph of Chloe that was still pinned to her evidence board. Auburn hair, green eyes, the particular brightness of a 22-year-old who believed that the truth was worth pursuing and that words had the power to change things. She thought about the unfinished sentence. The illusion of anonymity online creates a power asymmetry that she didn't know how Chloe would have finished it, but she knew how the world had finished it for her, and the ending was as brutal as it was preventable. Julian Vance had been reported twice. Twice, the system had shrugged. Twice, the women who'd raised alarms have been told, in essence, that what happened to them online wasn't real enough to act on. Chloe Dubois had proved, in most terrible way possible, that it was. Diallo unpinned the photograph, placed it in the file, and closed the cabinet. The city outside her window was doing what cities do. Moving, humming, carrying 5 million people through their Tuesdays and their Thursdays and their ordinary, irreplaceable evenings. Somewhere out there, someone was sitting at a laptop, writing something true. Somewhere else, someone was reading it and deciding they couldn't let it be published. The cursor blinks, the sentence waits, and the distance between the two, between the person who writes and the person who silences, is shorter than anyone wants to believe.